23rd March 1692. Dorothy Good, who lived in the village of Salem, had no idea that this day will change her life, from which there will be no point of return. For her, the morning of 23rd March 1692 must have been a sad but a regular morning. Sad because she must have been missing her mother, Sarah Good, who had been arrested a few days ago. What Dorothy didn't know was that a new warrant had been issued that morning, and this new warrant was for her arrest this time. Dorothy was accused of the same charges on which her mother was arrested, which were, quote, suspicion of acts of witchcraft, end quote. She was taken into custody that same day and jailed alongside her mother, Sarah, who had already been languishing in the dark cells of the dungeon since 3 weeks. Since witches were often kept in shackles in jail, special shackles must have been adapted to fit Dorothy's hands, because the regular shackles wouldn't fit her, because you see, Dorothy was only 4 years old. Hi, I am Rima, and this is Historia Maxima, where we talk about history, its wonderful stories, and the lessons it could possibly teach us. Trouble in the tiny Protestant village of Salem had started brewing a month earlier, in February 1692, when 11-year-old Abigail Williams and 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris, daughter of Reverend Samuel Parris, began acting strangely. It is said that the girls complained of bites, contorted their bodies, threw things, and fell into trances. A doctor's examination concluded that they were suffering from the evil effects of witchcraft. The girls were asked to name the names of their accomplices, and they did. By 1st March 1692, 3 women were taken into custody on charges of witchcraft, one of whom was Sarah Good, little Dorothy's mother. The Good family was painfully poor. The records tell us that they were beggars. Another woman to be arrested was Sarah Osborne, who had not attended church in some time. And the third woman was named Tituba. She was a slave at Reverend Samuel Parris's household. Tituba was tortured and made to confess more names, and she did. While clearly the initial accused were vulnerable women, those who were poor or of low social standing and a slave, but as more and more people started getting arrested, women of high social standing too came under the net. The very next 2 arrests were Rebecca Nurse and Martha Corey, both fully covenanted church members and women of high social standing. They were accused of witchcraft based on quote-unquote spectral evidence, meant that other people could testify in court that they received disembodied spirits or specters through dreams or visions by the accused women to harm the victims by stabbing, choking, biting, and jabbing them with pins. Now, to our 21st century mind, spectral evidence may sound frankly too stupid to even warrant a discussion. Back then, the authorities too found something wrong with the whole concept of it, but for a different reason. You see, for them, the real debate was how to interpret spectral evidence as legitimate evidence. Their big question was whether the devil could impersonate somebody with or without their permission. So that was tantamount to saying that Rebecca Nurse gave the devil her permission to go out and afflict her victims in her image. These accused women, Rebecca and Martha, were interrogated in public, which meant that all the townspeople listened in stunned and terrified silence as their supposed victims told their dramatic tales of how they had suffered from the evil spirits sent to them by Rebecca and Martha, no doubt causing quite an impression on the townspeople that must have carried on into their evening tavern gossip. This gossip of course added fuel to the fire, and over the next days, more people were accused of witchcraft, and within weeks, more than 150 people were formally arrested for practicing witchcraft. This prompted Governor Sir William Phips to establish a special court to try these witchcraft cases by the month of May of that year, and the court was presided over by William Stutton. The court did not convene until another month, till June the 2nd, 1692. So the arrested people just kept piling up in the already overcrowded jail cells, making the living conditions even worse for its inhabitants, which included the 4-year-old Dorothy with her tiny hands in her special tiny shackles. As the special court began its proceedings on 2nd June 1692, verdicts started coming in. 19 of the accused were hanged, 1 pressed to death. 5 others by this time had already died in jail, no doubt because of the subhuman conditions of an overcrowded cell full of the stink of unwashed bodies, shackled and malnourished, and terrified of their coming deaths. Rebecca Nurse's case came to court, the woman who was accused of spectral evidence. Rebecca was found not guilty by the jurors, but before Rebecca could breathe a sigh of relief, William Stutton, the man who was presiding over these cases, sent the jurors to quote-unquote reconsider. The jurors, taking the hint, changed their verdict to guilty. Rebecca was hanged on 19th July 1692. But she was not alone, because you see, the interrogations that had led Rebecca to her death were also used to extract confessions for other accused witches too. Little Dorothy too was subject to these interrogations. Evidence suggests that she was coerced during an interrogation to get a confession. One can't help wondering how much a 4-year-old child could rationally and reliably understand about concepts such as God, Satan, witchcraft, and even life and death. She must have been confused, perhaps not even fully understanding even the difference between good and evil. But that was clearly not what the authorities spent any time thinking about. We have a record that these quote-unquote examinations conducted on Dorothy by the magistrates, these examinations took place over a period of 3 days, ever since the day of her arrest, from 24th March till 26th March. We can only imagine what the clueless child must have felt in those 3 days, away from her mother and father, surrounded by cold and distant magistrates who perhaps did not even bother providing her with food and water, let alone a kind word to a confused, terrified, and terribly lonely child. The magistrates and ministers record Dorothy's interrogation in the court documents, saying that they, quote, unanimously affirm that when this child did but cast its eye upon the afflicted persons, they were tormented, end quote. They go on to say, quote, the afflicted complained that they had often been bitten by this child and produced the marks of a small set of teeth. Accordingly, this was also committed to Salem prison, end quote. Of course, by this, they mean the child, Dorothy. These same records also tell us of strange marks on Dorothy's forefinger, which were said to have been bite marks of Dorothy's pet snake, and the snake talked to her, and nobody else could see the snake. It was clearly in this incoherent testimony that Sarah Good's fate was sealed, because it was during these confessions that Dorothy Good confessed that her mother was a witch, and Sarah Good too was executed alongside Rebecca Nurse. When Sarah Good was originally arrested in March 1692, she had been pregnant. Her final days of pregnancy were spent locked away in the ghastly, overcrowded, dark dungeon, and it was here that she gave birth just a few weeks later. Unsurprisingly, the baby died a few hours after birth, and Sarah was taken to her execution soon after. While in jail, Dorothy had watched her mother give birth, her newborn sister dying, and then she'd seen her mother being led away to her execution. How must have her 4-year-old mind comprehended what was happening around her? She must have wondered why she was painfully shackled in a scary, dark, foul-smelling dungeon with strangers. What had she done that was so wrong that she was being so cruelly punished? And her only comfort in this unimaginable time must have been her mother, until she too was taken away one day, never to return, leaving Dorothy all alone for months with the horrors of the prison. By the time Dorothy was finally released on 10th December 1692, at the age of 5, Dorothy was insane. 18 years later, her condition had not improved. We know this from the letter her father, William Good, wrote to the court dated 13th September 1710. A poor man with hardly any social standing, he was still trying frantically to get justice for his family. In his petition, he wrote, quote, "To the Honorable Committee, the humble representation of William Good of the damage sustained by him in the year 1692, by reason of the sufferings of his family upon the account of supposed witchcraft. 1. My wife Sarah Good was in prison about 4 months and then executed. 2. A sucking child died in prison before the mother's execution. 3. A child of 4 or 5 years old was in prison 7 or 8 months and being chained in the dungeon was so hardly used and terrified that she hath ever since been very chargeable, having little or no reason to govern herself. And I leave it unto the honorable court to judge that damage I have sustained by such a destruction of my poor family." End quote. William Good was issued £30 as compensation. Let's try to end this on a slightly positive note. We earlier talked about the problem of spectral evidence that was used in witchcraft cases, where anyone could testify if they had disembodied spirits sent to them by accused witches, and this testimony could suffice to bring an accused to their death. It really is as disturbing and ridiculous as it sounds. Perhaps that's why, in October 1692, a prominent minister in Boston denounced the use of spectral evidence, saying, quote, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than 1 innocent person be condemned." End quote. A lot of people were against spectral evidence, so confessions became the top way to find people guilty. The confessions that came were from people with no agency whatsoever, like little Dorothy. Eventually, the magistrates got really good at interrogating people in private, and unsurprisingly, many of those who confessed were children as young as 6. By 1693, Governor Phips admitted that the trials were a mistake and compensated many of the families, but the damage was done.